Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one there are several developments across the front line in the eastern section of it. The Russians managed to advance west of RUAF in the direction of Siversk, to the northern flank of Toretsk, to the east of Pokrovsk, and in the Dnipropetrovsk region, and just south of that as well. Starting out in the southern parts of these Russian advances, the Russians managed to gain a foothold within the town of Zaporizhzhia here in the Donetsk region. The Russians managed to gain a foothold in the eastern parts of the town and are now confronting the Ukrainian forces in the fortified positions just south of it. We see that in this section of the front line, the Ukrainians have three settlements in between the two river lines, meaning it is completely isolated from other sections of the front line. The Ukrainians barely have any supply lines going into these areas, with the one north of Komor being protected by the fortified positions here southwest of Zaporizhzhia, and the northern flank of that being protected by additional supply line. The Russians are here looking to gain control over Zaporizhzhia and the fortified position to enter Yalta and Sirka, and then flank the fortified position from the north, attacking it directly from the east and from the south. The Russian objective with gaining control over this pocket in between the two river lines is to cover the southern flank of the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the river line to then cross over into the Dnipropetrovsk region in the direction of Filia and Dashne. The objective is to gain control over the highway leading up to Novopavlivka. It is becoming clear based on the recent advances by the Russians that they are looking to advance along the southern flank of Novopavlivka to then connect it to the eastern section of the front line, establishing supply lines for offensive operations from the south and from the east. At the same time, the Russians will be looking to gain control over Moravka and the fortified position there for an assault through the northeast of Novopavlivka, a combined assault from three separate directions from the south, southeast, and east of the town. Novopavlivka is likely a high priority target of the Russian forces, as it will allow them to break the stalemate around the city of Pokrovsk. Being able to gain control over Novopavlivka will allow the Russians to establish themselves with a supply hub within the Dnipropetrovsk region. This will significantly speed up offensive operations within the Dnipropetrovsk region. We see that on the western flank of Novopavlivka there is the town of Ivanivka. There's also the river line of the Solena River that moves through the central parts of the town. This makes it difficult for the Russians to gain control over the town, but once they gain control of it, they can continue offensive operations in several directions. The density of urban areas within the eastern parts of the Dnipropetrovsk region is extremely low. This means beyond that of Novopavlivka, there are a few towns. They are mostly centered around the highways. The Russians will be looking to advance along the highways mainly to establish themselves within these towns and go for the next supply hub, which will allow them to bypass fortified positions of the Ukrainians, attacking them from weak points while establishing proper supply lines that allow them to concentrate a large amount of forces. And that is exactly how it will allow the Russians to bypass the stalemate of Pokrovsk direction, as it will allow the Russians to bypass the fortified positions on the western flank of the city, establish proper supply lines where they don't have that much, and allow them to outnumber the Ukrainian forces and outflank them. It will also allow the Russians to break the stalemate in the Zaporizhzhia region by bypassing the defensive lines in the southern section of the front line and launching offensive operations towards the supply hubs that supplies the Ukrainian defensive lines and allow them to supply the Russian lines instead. For a Russian offensive into the Zaporizhzhia region, they need to gain control over the remaining parts of the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, as will allow the Russians to have control over the highway that leads directly to Pokrovsk, here in the flank of the Zaporizhzhia fortifications. With that, the Russians will have several supply lines into the Dnipropetrovsk region, from the Kurhova direction directly towards Pokrovsk, and further north through Andreevka into Novopavlivka, further up towards Meshova and Slovianka. This allowed the Russians to establish three separate supply hubs within the Dnipropetrovsk region, each for their own section of the front line. Advancing further westwards will allow the Russians to expand that further. In the eastern direction, everything will lead to Pokrovsk, to which a major battle will take place over the city itself, following which the Russians can establish themselves within Pokrovsk as their main supply hub and allowed Russians to supply the forces to the rear of the Donetsk region and into the Dnipropetrovsk region, as well as an additional supply hub that strengthened the Russians' positions within the Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk regions. On the eastern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to gain control over the remaining fortified positions here to the south of Melinivka. With this, the Russians will align the front line with the first lines and first patches south of Mirne, gain control over Mirne, and potentially start offensive operations along the Kazan-Terets River, along Mykolaiivka and Novoekonomichne. To gain control over both of these towns will allow the Russians to establish themselves on the eastern flank of Mirnorad. With their positions in Novhorodivka and Horodivka under their control, the Russians may start an offensive operation towards Mirnorad itself, start storming the town. As we saw with the Bakhmut direction, when the Russians operationally encircle a place, it is practically useless unless they also storm it at the same time. The reason for that is that the Russians want to draw in Ukrainian forces, as many as possible, into a pocket with limited supplies. If the Ukrainians do not send reinforcements and do not send supplies, then the operational encirclement is useless. Instead, storming it head-on will force the Ukrainians to send supplies and reinforcements, otherwise it will slowly degrade and the Russians will eventually gain control of it with little resistance. Therefore, the optimal solution for the Ukrainians in that scenario would be to break the siege, and this is why the Ukrainians' main focus is to prevent the siege in the first place. Further east in the direction of Toretsk, the Russians made a small advance towards the industrial area where fighting is taking place over it. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the final parts to completely secure the operational encirclement of the area, that is the industrial zone and the fortified positions, following which the Russians will likely start storming towns such as Novospassky, Sherbinivka, Katerinivka and Klebenbyk here on pretty much everything within the pocket that is being operationally encircled. Fighting is taking place along the river line in the direction of Katerinivka on the high ground west of Novospassky. Further north in the direction of the Siversk section of the front line, the Russians continue to advance west of Ryurivka, fighting over the fortified positions here east of Serebryanka. We see that the Russians have continuously been launching offensive operations towards the Siversk section of the front line over the last few months, and the Russians are slowly creeping towards the town and the fortified positions on the outside of it. The Russians are now fighting on the final fortified positions just outside of Siversk before the defensive line that is connected to the city. This means that the Russians are getting closer and closer to the battle over the city itself. Someone asked me, well, the Russians are here advancing with the Sversky Donetsk River in the Serbyansky forest area to the north where the Ukrainians are present, and the Ukrainians are also present in the south of Ryurivka. What is preventing the Ukrainian forces from launching a pincer maneuver, cut off the supplies of the Russian forces by attacking its supply lines? Well, it's fairly simple. Fortifications. The Russians are making these advances very slowly and they are advancing on a wider front. This is to secure the flanks. Currently what we're seeing is that there is a large forest area connected to Ryurivka in the south and to the west. It is now currently split between the Russian and Ukrainian forces, but all of the fortifications in the Ryurivka direction are now under Russian control. The Ukrainians have a single fortified position in the first line to the south, which after Russians gain control of, they'll be able to reach the southern outskirts of Serebrenka and gain control over the remaining parts of the forest area. The Ukrainians could cross over from the river line, but in that scenario, the Russians would be able to launch new operations from the eastern flank. They have several fortified positions around Bilorivka, and the Ukrainians would have a river line up against their back. Generally, that is when you have the most difficult situation. The Ukrainians are able to strike supplies going towards Ryurivka and towards the front line from the Serebrenka forest area, where the Ukrainians can have APV drone operators hitting the Russian supplies and reinforcements, and that is the biggest threat to the Russian offensive operations in the area, the general activity of Ukrainian FPV drones striking the supply lines and offensive operations of the Russians. Therefore, it is unrealistic that the Ukrainians will be able to launch a counterattack to cut off the supplies but they're already cutting off the supplies of the Russians by striking their positions with drones and artillery. In terms of the Russo-Ukrainian war, we see that the focus continues within the Donetsk region and will likely continue so until the Russians gain full control of it. The Russian operations in the north are all to divert Ukrainian resources for their own offensive operations in the Donetsk region, but also to prevent the Ukrainians from launching additional offensive operations into Russian territory. Regardless of whether the Russians have a buffer zone or not, the Ukrainian offensive capabilities and counteroffensive capabilities has been significantly decreased due to the lack of armored vehicles, especially since the US stopped sending additional ones since about a year ago. And this has led to a catastrophic lack of vehicles for the Ukrainian forces. They still have a lot, but not near enough to both keep their defense active and also to launch offensive or counteroffensive operations. And this is what allows the Russians to make much riskier operations. The Russians no longer face, an example, once they enter Zaporizhia, they no longer face a Bradley or Abrams tanks counterattacking on the Ukrainian side. Instead, they are getting struck by artillery, FPV drones. Potentially, there's an armored fighting vehicle that is attacking their positions, but in general, they are fairly safe beyond that of artillery and FPV drones. Instead, when the Russians were fighting over Avdiivka and they entered Dnipropetrovsk, the Ukrainians would continuously counterattack with both Abrams and Bradleys and other vehicles at the same time as they were using FPV drones and artillery. And this is what led to the Battle of Dnipropetrovsk taking over a month, compared to the Russians having advanced from Avdiivka all the way to the front line here around Pokrovsk within just a year's time. It's been a year and 4 months since the Russians captured Avdiivka, and since the Russian capture of Avdiivka, we have met a turning point that allowed the Russians to continuously advance without any major Ukrainian counterattacks. And this is the effects of the fortifications collapsing. If the Russians gain control over the remaining parts of the Donetsk region, we will see a similar significant change along the front line. Just the capture of Pokrovsk or Konstantinivka will have a similar impact as well. This means following the capture of Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, we may see a Russian advance that doubles or triples what it currently is for each of these cities, which means the Russians could be advancing at hundreds of square kilometers every day. And once the complete capture of Donetsk happens, the Russians will likely be continuously advancing hundreds of square kilometers every day until they reach the entirety of the Dnieper River. Because beyond the Donetsk region, the only obstacle to Russian advances are the major cities such as Zaporizhia, Dnipro, Kharkiv, and Poltava. Simply because the fortifications of the Ukrainians are incomparable within the Donetsk region and outside of it. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.